He acts like an adult about this. Why can't you? My girlfriend asked. She defended sharing one King Deluxe suite with her old friend while making me the problem. After 3 years, I didn't yell. I left the booking screenshot on her pillow and disappeared before she got home. I'm Alex, 29, financial analyst. At the time this happened, I'd been with Qley for 3 years. She was 28, marketing manager at a mid-sized agency. We'd been living together for about 18 months, shared apartment, shared expenses, shared friend group. Dave, Sarah, Lisa. The usual setup you build when two people stop being a couple and start being a household. I wasn't the suspicious type. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to understanding how all of this played out. I'd never gone through her phone, never demanded location updates, never made a thing out of who she was texting or where she was going on a given night. I'd built this relationship on the assumption that trust was something you gave, not something you extracted through surveillance and double-checking. We had the small things, like any couple that's been together long enough. A running joke about hotel pillows, she'd say you could sleep on a bag of rocks and call it boutique. She'd told me once, early on, that she only ever really wanted to travel with someone she loved. I'd kept that, filed it somewhere it felt significant and quietly personal. Mark had come up maybe 4 or 5 times over those 3 years. Always casually. Always after bumping into him somewhere, a mutual friend's party, a birthday dinner, and ministry innings, a work event where the same industry circles overlap. Just an old friend, she'd say, same phrasing every time, and I'd nod, and the conversation would move on to something else. He wasn't a presence in our life. He was a name that surfaced occasionally and then receded. I never pushed for more. I didn't want to be the person who made things complicated over an old friendship. Didn't want to come across as controlling. Didn't want to be the guy who needed a full accounting of everyone his girlfriend had ever known. I didn't want to be weird about it. She'd used that framing before, not about Mark specifically, but about other things. Little redirects. If I ever circled something and she didn't want to go there, the subject would become my attitude about the subject. I'd taken that as a sign that I was a reasonable person who chose not to push. Later, I'd understand it differently. 2 weeks before that Sunday, Qley mentioned a work conference. Marketing industry thing, she said, about 90 minutes away, running Thursday through Saturday. She was vague on the details. Name of the conference, name of the hotel, who else was going. I didn't push. Work conferences are vague. I'd been to enough of them to know that the logistics rarely feel worth explaining in full. I offered to drive her to the station on Thursday morning. She said Dave was giving her a lift. Fine. Saturday afternoon she texted, conference ran long, staying one more night, back Sunday. I told her to have fun. I watched something, cooked for one, went to bed at a normal hour. I was genuinely, completely okay with all of it. There was nothing about those 3 days that felt off in a way I could point to. I went about my weekend. Sunday, a few hours before she was due back, I sat down at her laptop. She'd asked me specifically, earlier that week, to handle the direct debit setup for her rent invoice. Her landlord had switched payment systems, she'd been putting it off for 2 months, and she'd walked me through exactly where to find everything and handed me the login herself. It was the kind of small, administrative task couples hand off to each other. I opened the browser. The rent account page was in one tab. In the tab right next to it, the one she'd left open when she'd closed the laptop Friday morning and packed her bag, was a hotel confirmation email. Riverside Hotel. Booking confirmation. Guest names. Qley Bennett and Mark S. Room type. King Deluxe. Check-in, Thursday. Check-out, Sunday. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop. I made dinner. Set the table. Sat down and waited for her to come home. And while I waited, I thought about the fact that she'd handed me the laptop herself, walked me through the login herself, and trusted me to only look at the tab she'd intended me to see. She'd been right about that, right up until she wasn't. When she walked in and I told her what I'd found, she didn't miss a beat. I didn't tell you because you'd be weird about it. Then, it was a practical decision. Splitting the room saved money. He knows the area, he got us a good rate. She delivered this like a press release. Calm, organized. The explanation was already assembled and waiting, which meant it had been assembled before she ever walked through the door, which meant she'd known this moment was coming and had chosen her words in advance. I was in the bedroom by then, pulling out my overnight bag from the top shelf. She followed me in. You're doing exactly what I knew you would. I stopped folding for a second. Not only because it did hurt, but because of what it meant. She'd anticipated this reaction before she made the booking. She'd weighed it, factored it in, decided it was an acceptable cost, and clicked confirm anyway. That wasn't a bad moment or a lapse in judgment. That was a deliberate decision made in full knowledge of what it would cost us, and she'd made it anyway. I kept packing. That night, alone, I started putting things together that I'd been consciously choosing not to look at directly for a long time. The night at dinner when I'd glanced at her phone screen not to snoop, just a reflex, and she'd pulled it away and said, flatly, "Can you stop being paranoid for 5 minutes?" The weekend she'd said she was staying at Lisa's that Lisa had been strangely vague about afterward. In that particular way, people are when they're not sure whether confirming something helps or doesn't. The way any question that drifted even slightly toward Mark would somehow become a conversation about my relationship with trust, my tendency to overanalyze, my need to feel secure. Every time I'd come close to something, the conversation had rerouted. The problem became my asking, not whatever I was asking about. She'd been running this play for a while. I'd just been a good enough sport about it that she'd started to count on it. At 11:47 p.m., I remember looking at the clock on the nightstand. A text arrived. "If you could talk to me like an adult instead of shutting down, we could actually work through this." My silence had become the problem. My not raising my voice, my packing quietly, my choosing not to burn the night to the ground that had been identified as dysfunction and sent back to me with a label on it. She needed me to argue so she could manage the argument on her terms, redirect it into a conversation about my communication style, keep the frame on me instead of on the hotel booking. I hadn't given her that, so she'd found a different angle. I put the phone face down and went to sleep. Before I'd said a single word to anyone, she'd already made her calls. Dave texted me the next morning. "Hey, Qley said things got a little rough. You doing okay?" I said I was fine. That was the whole reply. A couple of days later, through a mutual friend, I heard that Qley had reached out to Sarah with her version. Alex found out I shared a hotel room with an old friend to cut costs and completely lost it. He left without even giving me a chance to explain. He's always been like this about my male friendships. That was the story moving through our social circle. Alex has a control problem. Alex can't handle his girlfriend having male friends. Alex went weird over something totally innocent and walked out. In the version being distributed, I was the problem. What struck me most wasn't that she'd told people. It was the specific language she'd used. Innocent room share. Always been like this. Went weird. That wasn't someone venting to friends after a hard night. That was a prepared statement with coherent phrasing across multiple recipients. The wording was consistent because it had been drafted, not improvised. Dave's text had the careful, diplomatic neutrality of a good person trying to stay fair to two people he cared about. I understood that. I also understood that she'd gotten to him first, and that the frame she'd built around the story was the frame he was now working from. He'd been handed a picture and had no reason yet to question it. Sarah had gotten a variation of the same call. The through line was the same across both of them. I'd overreacted to something reasonable, left without allowing a conversation, confirmed something she'd apparently been managing around for a while, that I couldn't handle her having a life that included male friends. I didn't reach out to Sarah. Didn't call Dave back with my version. Didn't start drafting a response. I let the story sit there, unchallenged, for 5 days. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say. Because I needed to say it once, cleanly, to the right person, with the right piece of information attached. And I needed to do that without making noise before I was ready. On the 5th day, Dave called. He was careful about it, measured, genuinely trying to be fair, but I could hear the shape of the story underneath what he was saying. "Look, I want to hear your side. But from what Qley's described, it sounds like it might have been a group situation conference. Multiple people. She said it was just a cost-sharing arrangement. The kind of thing people do." "Hold on," I said. I texted him the screenshot of the hotel confirmation. Then I added one sentence underneath it. I was printing her rent invoice. This tab was open next to the document she'd asked me to handle. Nothing else. He didn't respond that day. Or the next. He called back on the 3rd day. His voice was different. Quieter. More careful in a different way than before, not diplomatic careful, but the careful of someone who just recalibrated something. He told me what he'd assumed. A conference meant a group. Shared accommodation meant a block of rooms across multiple people. A few colleagues splitting costs the way you do when the company isn't covering the whole thing. He'd heard conference and sharing a room to save money and assembled a picture from those pieces, because the picture was available and it was the one he'd been given. But it was just the two of them, he said. More statement than question. "Yeah," I said. He paused. King Deluxe. Yeah. A beat of silence. I didn't have the full picture. That was it. No dramatic outrage on my behalf. No performance. Just a man rereading something with a piece of information that hadn't been there before and landing somewhere different than he'd started. Lisa reached out the same week, unprompted. She told me she wanted me to know that she hadn't vouched for Qley's version. When Qley had called her, she'd said very little. She hadn't known what to say, and silence had seemed safer than the wrong thing. But she hadn't signed on to the framing either. I didn't co-sign it, she said. 3 words. She'd apparently just needed me to know. I hadn't even known Qley had called her. What was happening wasn't loud or dramatic. No group chat explosions. No sides being publicly declared. It was quieter, more like watching scaffolding become unavailable. The story Qley had circulated required people to accept certain assumptions without too many follow-up questions. The screenshot made people ask follow-up questions. And once they asked, they found out that a group conference trip with a cost-sharing room had been 1 King Deluxe suite, 2 names, 4 nights. A practical decision to split costs is a double room, maybe 2 singles. Not a King Deluxe at the Riverside. That detail, the one she'd left out of every call she'd made, was the thing her version couldn't survive once someone knew to look for it. I moved my things out on a Tuesday, while Qley was at work. Not to avoid a confrontation, I just didn't need one. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and I didn't have anything to add to it. I handled the lease through the property manager. I was a co-signer on the apartment, so there was paperwork involved, but it was clean and straightforward. I made the calls I needed to make, signed what needed signing, kept everything documented and professional. I took everything that was mine and nothing that wasn't. I left the kitchen equipment because she'd bought most of it. I left the good pots. I took the olive oil because I'd bought that, and because I'm not going to lie, it felt like the correct thing to take. Before I left, I sent her one text. I'm not weird about it. I know what I'm worth. I turned off read receipts and drove to work. The voicemail started that evening. First one, she was sorry things had escalated. She wanted to talk. She believed we could work through this if I'd just give her the chance to explain it properly, to give her the room to lay it all out. Second, you're throwing away 3 years over a misunderstanding. That's not fair to either of us. Third was longer, less composed. She cried through most of it. I saved all of them. I didn't listen to the last one for months. I didn't reply to any of them. Not because I was performing composure or running some kind of strategy. The hurt was real and it didn't go away quickly. 3 years of a life with someone doesn't dissolve in a week, and there were nights in those first couple of months that were genuinely hard, and I'm not going to dress that up into something cleaner than it was. But every time I thought about calling back, every time I drafted something in my head, I'd come back to that text at 11:47 p.m. She'd called my silence shutting down, said it like a clinical assessment. So I let her be right about that. 6 months later, I was in a gourmet grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of place with $18 cheese and ambient jazz and lighting calibrated to make everything feel slightly more intentional than it is. I was there with Dave and Lisa. We'd developed a loose Saturday thing: pick a neighborhood, walk around, end up somewhere for a late lunch. It had become one of those routines that settles in without you planning it. 2 months earlier, the director position had come through. The team was larger than what I'd been managing, the work harder, and I was genuinely surprised to find I liked it more than I'd expected to. There was a weight to it that felt right, the kind of responsibility that asks something real of you. The week before the grocery store, I'd put a deposit down on an apartment. The neighborhood I'd mentioned once, early in my relationship with Qley, mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you want so much, you've stopped saying it directly. She'd called it overpriced and changed the subject. I'd kept the thought, and eventually I did something with it. I was standing in the cheese section, holding a wedge of manchego, half listening to Dave make what was turning into a fairly extended argument for a slightly more aggressive Gouda, when I looked up and saw her. Qley. Mark was with her. They were near the prepared food section, maybe 30 feet away. He was studying a jar of preserved lemons with the focused, deliberate attention of a man who very badly wanted to appear absorbed in a jar of preserved lemons. Qley saw me before I'd fully registered that I was seeing her. I watched her, in about half a second, decide what to do. She came over. She was warm. A little too warm, the warmth of someone who had decided well in advance how this reunion was going to feel and had prepared for it. She greeted Dave and Lisa by name, asked what everyone was up to. I told her about the promotion matter-of-factly, the way you'd relay any piece of neutral information to someone you used to know. Mentioned the apartment. She nodded in that particular way. That's working very hard to read as happiness for someone else. Then she said, I really hope you've had some time to think about everything. I honestly believe that if you'd been able to see the full situation clearly, you would have realized it wasn't what it looked like. I looked at her. Then I looked at Mark, who had smoothly transitioned from the preserved lemons to a jar of olive tapenade and appeared to be reading the ingredients list with scholarly intensity. Then I looked back at Qley. I understood it fine the first time, I said. I turned back to Dave, who had apparently finalized his position on the Gouda. We picked it up. We kept moving through the store. Qley didn't follow. I heard her say something quietly to Mark as they drifted toward the far end of the aisle. Neither Dave nor Lisa said anything about what had just happened. We checked out, walked to the restaurant we'd decided on, and nobody brought it up over lunch. They didn't need to. I didn't need them to. What she'd tried, standing in that cheese aisle, was the same thing she'd tried every time I'd come close to something she didn't want examined. You didn't understand. If you'd seen it clearly, you'd have felt differently. The problem was your perception, not the thing you were perceiving. It had worked, for a long time, because I'd been more interested in not being a problem than in looking directly at what was there. Because I'd chosen to file things away rather than sit with them, because I hadn't wanted to be weird about it. But I'd read a hotel confirmation on a laptop she'd handed me access to herself. I'd read the names. I'd read the room type. I'd heard her explanation and listened to what she chose to say, and then I'd watched her tell me I was doing exactly what she'd already predicted I'd do. I understood it fine the first time. The second time she tried it, in a grocery store 6 months later, with Mark 15 feet away pretending to evaluate tapenade, it landed exactly the same way it had the first time. She got nothing new from that aisle. The practical decision didn't hold. Qley and Mark ended about 4 months after the grocery store. She'd moved in with him after she left our apartment, a smaller place across town. From what I heard secondhand, a step down in most of the ways that tend to matter. The arrangement didn't survive. I don't know the specifics and didn't go looking for them. A few months after that, her company went through a restructure. Her marketing manager role was one of the positions cut. Lisa mentioned it once, in passing, without editorializing, the way you'd relay a news item that happened to involve someone you both used to know. Last she'd heard, Qley was picking up freelance contracts where she could some work coming through, inconsistently, rebuilding a client list from scratch. The friend group didn't fracture in any dramatic, announced way. Nobody held a summit. Nobody drew lines. But Dave became the one who sent the dinner invites and the weekend texts. The casual, ongoing invitations that keep a social network alive and functional. Those found their way to me. I don't know that they went to Qley in the same volume or with the same ease. She hadn't done anything to Dave or Sarah or Lisa directly, but she'd asked them to carry a story that turned out to be built on a version of events that didn't match a booking confirmation, and that kind of thing sits with people even when they're too decent to say it out loud. My Thursday evenings now. I cook something real. A braise, a proper stock, something that takes actual time and can't be rushed into something it isn't. I do it in my own kitchen, in the apartment in the neighborhood I'd always quietly wanted. The director role is good. Hard in the right ways, which is the only way I've ever actually wanted hard work to feel. For a while I kept the voicemail folder on my phone. Around month 4, I sat down one evening and played the last one. Her voice. The crying. The word misunderstanding, making one more appearance. Then, I deleted the folder. What I think about now, when any of this surfaces, and it surfaces less and less, isn't the hotel booking or the conversation with Dave or even her face in the grocery store aisle. I think about the 5 seconds after I said I understood it fine the first time and turned back to Dave. There was a feeling in my chest in those 5 seconds that I didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction or relief at being vindicated. It was quieter than any of those things. I recognized it a while later. It was relief. The specific, clean relief of someone who'd spent a long time wondering if his own reactions were the problem and had finally, without drama, stopped wondering. She told me I'd be weird about it. She was right that I'd feel something. She just never calculated what it would feel like when I stopped.